Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Brianna McCain, and I'm a Policy Associate at Advance CTE. This is the first webinar in Advance CTE's Summer Learning Series. This webinar will focus on what learners most need during the COVID-19, also known as coronavirus pandemic. Today, we will discuss what it means to advance equity in CTE during the pandemic through a learner-centered lens. Specifically, you will hear 3 different perspectives on how COVID-19 has widened equity gaps for historically marginalized populations, as well as considerations and strategies that state CTE leaders can leverage to close those equity gaps. Time permitting, we will have a short Q&A at the end. But regardless of whether we have time to have a Q&A, I encourage you to drop any questions that you have for the speakers or me in the chat box so that we can tailor our future content to meet your specific needs. At the end of this presentation, there will be a slide that has all the speakers' contact information. So if we don't have time for a Q&A, feel free to reach out to the speakers that way. I will also ask that you complete a short evaluation at the end of this presentation. To help me unpack the topics of this webinar, I'm joined by Michaela Leslie Rule, who is a senior strategist at Wonder Strategies for Good, Jacob Agus-Kleinman, who's a policy analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center, and Carrie, who is the president of the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. So before I turn the presentation over to the speakers, I want to discuss what it means to advance equity in CTE, particularly during this pandemic. On the screen, you see Advance CTE's statement on equity in CTE. To advance equity in CTE means to construct systems that support each learner in accessing, feeling welcome in, fully participating in, and successfully completing a high-quality CTE program. Equity is not just about making sure students have access to opportunities, but also that students are having positive experiences and receiving the supports they need to successfully complete those opportunities. Unfortunately, coronavirus has presented many challenges to advancing equity in CTE. CTE focuses on real-world skills and applied learning. CTE students often engage directly with industry and are able to participate in work-based learning and earn industry-recognized credentials. However, during this pandemic, the digital divide has made it difficult for some learners to access instruction. Many learners have not been able to engage in hands-on learning, and many learners have not been able to sit for their credential exams. However, these challenges have also presented an opportunity for state leaders to be innovative and scale high-quality CTE opportunities to learners virtually. As state leaders develop strategies to close equity gaps exacerbated by coronavirus, they must maintain their commitment to quality, access, and equity during this time. Part of this means that learners still need to have access to the experiences and supports that allow them to engage in career exploration and develop their occupational identity. To help unpack this, I'm going to turn it over to Michaela from Wonder Strategies for Good.
Thanks, Brianna. Hello, everyone. Brianna, I hope everyone can hear me. I think so. So I want to just say thank you for inviting me to speak on this panel, and also specifically thanks to Advance CTE for the invitation. I wear sort of 2 hats. So one is as Wonder Strategies for Good. That's who I'm working on, working with right now. But I also previously was a co-lead on this research around occupational identity formation with Goodwin-Simon Strategic Research. So today I'm just going to share a little bit about the research that we conducted in 2018 and 2019. And a summary of this research will be available later in June, and then a full report in July. Next slide, please. So Brianna asked me to talk about, first give you sort of a high-level overview of the identity research, and then to talk specifically about potential implications for learners during the COVID-19 pandemic, and then hopefully a drill down a little bit on implications for CTA systems. I do want to say that because of where we are in the research, these are our ideas. These are sort of our ideas about potential ways that the implications might roll out. No crystal ball here. We're still doing some additional research on the back end that we'll talk about. Next slide. So many of you probably realize this, but for decades, We've been spending a lot of time thinking about the skills that young people need to develop, or the sort of academic capabilities that they need to develop in order to be successful. And this has to some degree minimized the role that identity and relationships can play in young people's lives and in their decision making. So now there's sort of a nascent emerging area of research that's focused specifically on occupational identity, defined as how young people envision their future selves in the workforce, what they think they can do, what they believe they're skilled at, and where they feel they can belong. And we feel like this is important because, in particular, when the research is conducted from a youth perspective, there's an opportunity to inform the interventions, models, tools, and other public assets that can eventually increase the career exposures young people experience, and also the diversity and breadth and depth of young people's opportunities for career exploration. So it's just a better match. Next slide. I said this briefly, but the research partner was Goodwin-Simon Strategic Research. It was a 16-month research project. They conducted the research in partnership with the Equitable Futures, which is a project of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the idea was to conduct deep listening research on the impact of young people's own mindsets on the formation of their occupational identity, work, and life goals. So the youth voice is often missing in this space, right? There's often like surveys that are done from an adult perspective. So it's sort of third-hand knowledge. Young people's ideas, their experiences, their perspectives, their sort of unique intelligences are often undervalued and often ignored. And in particular, this is the case for Black and Hispanic young people and young people from households with lower incomes. So part of the question for this work was kind of thinking about what would it be like to let young people drive the conversation? And if we did that, would it add an added sort of dimension to efforts to improve career pathways for young people? We're hopeful by doing this exploration from a youth perspective that it will sort of add a complementary layer to some of the work that you all are already doing. Next slide. So just to sort of credibility, there were about 4,000 Black, Hispanic, and white youth participants. The ages were between 15 and 21. We did 47 groups with youth, 15 to 21, and then with young adults, we did 3 groups, 26 to 29, asking them to reflect on their own pathways and inflection points that had taken place in their lives and sort of how they thought about those inflection points as they related to their pathways for thriving. We also talked to some adults, and the adults were parents and guardians of young people 15 to 21, and then adult influencers, so people that are working with young people or volunteering with young people in some capacity. Next slide. So 7 interviews at the top, just for the structure of the work. 7 interviews at the top, testing the guide, testing the methodology. 57 focus groups overall, all over the country, including rural and urban. 2 multi-day groups in English and Spanish that were online focus groups. So these are four-day focus groups where young people are sort of interacting with moderators online, responding to probes, doing pathways, making videos, and then we analyze that. And then an online national survey at the end with about 3,500 young people, 15 to 21. And just a sense of what came out of these, right? So we have pathways. This is just a quick, and I know you can't see this, so this is just a quick idea of what we had. We had young people draw their potential pathways with a goal, where they wanted to go and where they thought they were now. And there's just incredible diversity in that. Even when you're talking to someone who's 15, 16, 17, sometimes they place themselves 3 or 4 steps in, like you see on the left side. And other times, you know, they place themselves off of the pathway entirely, even though they're in school and making steps. So this was part of the analysis. An important piece of this is asking them to reflect on the barriers or challenges that they anticipate encountering, and how their identity sort of plays into that. And then the next slide. And then there's sort of more traditional what you get out of focus groups, which is quotes. And we pulled this quote in particular because it speaks to this idea of surviving and thriving. In this quote, this young woman from LA says that you can be successful on your own, right? I mean, you're just depending on yourself, but that's just surviving, basically. But if you have a diverse support system for everything you need, then you can reach your goals, and that you can thrive. Next slide. So I wanted to give you an overview of these key insights. We did the research, we conducted the analysis, and really we elevated 8 key insights. The first is around young people seeing themselves as their own best change agent. So young people feel like they are the most important change agents in their lives. This probably doesn't come to a surprise. This is not surprising to those of you who work with young people this age. They're making decisions every day that shape their futures, and their decisions are really informed by their own life experience. And that's sort of contrary to the public narrative, that young people are not informed, that they don't know enough, that they're not pragmatic. Young people actually are constantly every day making serious decisions about their pathways. They see themselves as capable, they see themselves full of agency, and they're very curious and resourceful. They research and pursue education and career paths that interest them. The second is young people experience work as surviving, striving, and thriving. And this has to do with an emergent model that I'm gonna come back to a little bit later. But essentially, we wanted to understand how young people emotionally connect to their work pathways. And what we found is that they really think about their pathways as a mix of personal and work experiences. So young people are not necessarily thinking of the destination in some of the sort of the way that often the career narrative is that you go on your pathway and you find your way to a specific destination, and now you have a career, ta-da, it's all done, right? Young people aren't thinking of it in that way. They think about work as a journey, and that journey is characterized by aspects of surviving, striving, and thriving. The third is youth, about experiencing identity as an asset. And we think this is particularly important because of the public narrative, often about young people of color and young people that come from low-income households. Black and Hispanic young people in particular view their racial and ethnic and cultural identity as an asset. So they think that these parts of their identity will help them as they move through their lives. This is counter in some ways to some of the sort of messaging, the public messaging that these young people receive. Fourth is around aspiring to live a good life. This goes back to this idea of work as a journey. Young people think about living a good life. They think qualitatively about what that good life will feel like, what it will feel like to be thriving. And they think about the work, the name of the job as a means to an end. So young people are not necessarily asking themselves, what do I want to be when I grow up or when I'm an adult, but they're asking themselves, how do I want to live? Another important piece here is that there's the language really matters. That what we found in our research is that young people have really more negative connotations with the word job as a standalone word, and more positive associations with the word career. And even work is more of that journey sort of metaphor. Fifth is that young people want to try on their futures. So they really yearn to explore. Young people of all income levels really yearn to explore and value opportunities to explore career pathways, to explore the diversity of opportunities that are available to them. We learned that from young people themselves through sort of self-reporting, and then through parents of specifically young people from lower income households or parents who have lower incomes, that there's a lot of pressure, that they feel a lot of pressure to make the right choice early on, or to make premature decisions about their futures in order to avoid sort of a sense of risk. The sixth is around envisioning pathways to thriving. We've touched on that a little bit. And mostly it's just that they're very optimistic, and we'll be interested to see how that changes or shifts over time during COVID, whether their optimism is impacted. And then they're empowered by connections. This is that young people really feel like it's all about me. They feel like they're making decisions by themselves about their pathways. And that many feel like they need support, but they're not sure where to get that support. And at the same time, they are incredibly independent. They feel independent. They want to be able to seek out opportunities and feel like they themselves can be assets to other young people. And then finally, it's around, the last insight is around young people seeing an opportunity in conversation. So one of the things that was very striking for us was the way that young people exited the focus groups, and some of their thinking on the rarity of having an opportunity to speak with peers about their career pathways. They talked about sort of, in transformational ways about what it was like to talk about their dreams in a non-judgmental setting. So we can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to lift up a couple of things before wrapping up here that may be interesting to you all in the spaces in which you work. I mentioned this earlier around the finding around surviving, striving, and thriving. And this is an emergent framework that we're working on. The idea is that young people have different ways of thinking about jobs and relationships to this framework and this model. Where surviving is kind of living paycheck to paycheck or having no job. They feel that they're struggling to make ends meet. Striving is that they feel like they have goals and are following stepping stones. They're making decisions, they're acquiring knowledge, they're helping to advance themselves towards thriving. And then thriving is that they feel like they've reached their goals and attained their personal version of a good life. And most young people imagine themselves to be thriving. Next slide. So some opportunities that we see here is around interventions that target young people. Let me start over. I think one of the opportunities that we see there is around a reorientation towards thriving. So many of the programs that we observed and programs that we read about have milestones as sort of, this is what success looks like. So we're curious about what it would look like to reorient towards thriving that's more expansive for young people. And we're also interested in potentially understanding opportunities for implementation, where young people are targeted to move from surviving to striving or striving to thriving, but not necessarily always to thriving, just depending on where they are. So potentially there's an opportunity to think about measurements or indices for surviving, striving, and thriving.
Michaela, it seems like you may have frozen. Well, I will just continue reading her slides and hopefully it will make sense to you all. One of the other insights that came from the research that she did was that young people experience identity as an asset. So it's important to develop tools and communication materials that shine a spotlight on Black and Hispanic young people and the strengths and pride they derive from their racial and ethnic identities. It's also important to support young people to build a bridge between the positive ways that many see themselves and the skills and capabilities needed to succeed. And I think this is particularly relevant right now as states think about re-entry for students. I know a lot of states are in the process of developing re-entry plans, and I think it's really important that that students' strengths are leveraged when thinking about those plans, and that state leaders take an asset-minded framework when thinking about how to support students who may have quote unquote like fallen behind, and how can we build systems around their students and leverage their strengths and identities.
Thank you.
Okay, good.
That's awesome. Thank you. The final thing, I'm sorry about the technology failure. The final thing I wanted to lift up, that was amazing, is another framework. And this one is about how young people experience occupational identity formation. So what we have, this is still very emergent and sort of new thinking, but what we're thinking is that young people pass through 3 stages where they refine their occupational identities, and it's essentially they're learning more about themselves, and they're starting to narrow and winnow down their perception of what a good life is and thriving. So exposure, exploration, selection. Again, the process of around refinement of cohesive occupational identity. Another piece of this is that they're continually increasing their level of agency as they move through these stages. And then finally, that there's an iterative and compounding effect. So this graphic does not show that, but we're working on iterating it so that it does. But the idea is that some young people may go from exposure, what they know, what's immediately around them, to making a selection around their career pathways and not have the opportunity to do exploration, deep exploration. Other young people may go through exposure, exploration, and then selection, and then come back to exploration because now they have had these other experiences and now they're more aware of who they are, or they're sort of learning more about themselves. And then they sort of continue to make a more refined choices around what will suit them best in the future. And next slide. And so I think this is like the meat of it for you all potentially. The low risk settings piece, that's what young people want. They really want to be able to explore, especially young people from lower income communities. They feel like there's a huge pressure to make premature choices. And so anything that it feels like there's a real opportunity to create low risk opportunities for exploration. Obviously in the sort of current context of COVID, the other question is to what degree young people's experience of this particular moment is going to influence their perception perception of risk. So when we were doing our research in 2018-19, they were talking about financial risk, right, in terms of what they knew, which was either an immediate experience of financial instability or parent experiences of work and instability, or kind of stories they'd heard about 2019, 2010, and sort of the ripple effect of that. Now they're living it. So I think there's an opportunity to understand at a deeper level what risk looks like now, and what low risk potentially could be for experimentation and exploration. And the last piece I just want to lift up, and then I'll close, is that part of this is a communications narrative issue. Young people need to hear that iterative processes, ongoing refinement, that this is a process, that you don't have to make the right decision the first time, that there is value in exploring and failing and deciding that something is not for you. Those messages are important for young people, but they're also really important for the adults in their lives to just kind of calm down the anxiety around what this looks like and what it looks like to sort of find a career in this moment. And importantly, given the COVID context right now, it also feels really critical to engage parents and other adults in young people's lives because of the role that they're playing right now as lead educators and sort of lead everything. So what would that potentially look like? The last thing I want to say is that we are doing additional research. It's on the next slide. We're doing additional research this year. We're doing another online focus group next month. And we're also doing a rolling tracking survey. So we're trying to learn more about young people and occupational identity at this moment, and how COVID and disruptions caused by COVID are impacting young people's perceptions of their futures. And we'll have new tools and resources available through the website, equitablefutures.org. And there's a newsletter called Wayfinders where we're publishing a lot of this. And young people made all these images. So that's it. Thanks very much. And I'm so sorry about the technology problem.
No worries. Thank you so much, Michaela. I think your presentation just underscores how important it is to make the case for CTE, particularly your points around students wanting to make sure they're on pathways that allow them to thrive, and that students want to feel supported and interact with a variety of people to support them. And I think CTE does that through work-based learning, career advisement, and other methods. So thank you for providing that context. I think it's very useful. So while Michaela's research touched on a lot of different populations, we're going to drill down to some more specific populations moving forward. And I'm going to turn it over to Jacob to talk about what state CTE leaders can do to support juvenile justice and adult justice involved adults during this time.
Great, thank you so much, Brianna. As she mentioned, my name is Jacob Agus-Kleinman. I'm a policy analyst at the Council State Government Justice Center. I'm going to talk a little bit about how CTE directors can partner with both juvenile and criminal justice systems to support gaining access to high quality services. Just a couple of quick notes. People define young adult, youth, adult differently in different jurisdictions, different individuals, different organizations. And then different states obviously have different barriers about where an individual may fall in juvenile justice or in the criminal justice system. So throughout this presentation, I'll just be referring to the justice system. It's important to recognize, though, that when reaching out and making those distinctions, that there is really that difference between working with the juvenile justice system and a criminal justice system and making that determination. So moving to the next slide. One of the things we wanted to talk about was, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there had been really a big push and a lot of momentum about getting high quality CTE and workforce development services to this justice-involved youth and young adult population. However, once the pandemic hit, the impacted justice systems in a slightly different way than the rest of society. The first is that the primary concern for almost all justice systems immediately turned to public health, both for those who were incarcerated in facilities, as well as for the people who were working in those facilities. As many of you know, many of the largest outbreaks in the country are traced back directly to prisons and juvenile justice facilities, and that really sucked up sort of all the oxygen and focus when this was first impacting. And one of the consequences of the public health reaction to that is the reduced access to facilities for service providers that were working in facilities not being able to get in, facilities to continue providing services, not being able to bring youth and young adults together in this space. to provide those services, not to be able to do that hands-on work. And then for individuals who are under community supervision in the community, obviously, as you all know, a lot of services weren't available, but case contacts for individuals who are going through cognitive behavioral therapy or other wraparound services were also reduced, really inhibiting the ability of individuals to access the full range of services. And then a final barrier is, as with many low-income populations, previously justice-involved individuals really struggle to access consistent internet and other tools for distance learning, such as laptops, computers, just high-speed internet just to be able to stream, and that's proven to be a real barrier. But one positive benefit, and something that I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, is through some conversations, is that a lot of already in the planning processes to get individuals who are justice involved, especially those in facilities, access to tablets and other distance-based training tools was accelerated by this process. And we've actually heard that there's now more access to tablets and the internet within the juvenile and adult facilities than there were prior to the pandemic hitting. So there's a small silver lining that we can try to utilize to improve services. Moving on to the next slide. The reason there had been so much momentum around meeting the CTE and workforce development needs of this population is partly because of how large of an impact it has. So as you can see, every single year, 30,000 youth are incarcerated in the US. An additional 325,000 youth are placed on some form of probation. 10 million adults are reentering the community from jail or prison, and 74 million adults in the US have some form of a criminal record. So you're talking about a really large population that has historically really struggled and needs access to services. And looking on the next slide, even prior to the pandemic, this is a population that was really struggling. So prior to COVID, when we were facing an economy with record low unemployment, even at that point, those who had been formerly incarcerated had an unemployment rate of approximately 27%. The rest of the US has now caught up to that number, but that's a number that was higher than what we were seeing during the Great Depression. So even when the economy was sustaining record low unemployment, this is a population that was really struggling to gain access to the workforce in a sustained and meaningful way. Next slide. And young adults in particular were a population that was really struggling to connect. So as of 2019, there were approximately 4.7 million young adults aged 16 to 24 who were disconnected from both education and the workforce. And as with many things, this is something that followed disproportionately on youth of color. That number of disconnection was actually nearly 1 in 5, so a little over 20% of Black youth among that population were disconnected from both education and the workforce. So you're talking about a really large population that was really struggling even prior to this pandemic, and really required detailed services that were age appropriate and that really met the needs of these individuals where they were. So moving to the next slide. And within that cohort, justice-involved individuals faced even more barriers than the rest of that young adult. So we know that disconnected youth and young adults are more likely to be in contact with the justice system, but for those that then do become justice-involved, they see often lower levels of formal educational attainment and less work experiences that would allow them to engage. Just as an example, 36% of people in state prisons had attained less than a high school education. That compares to 19% of the education as a whole. And only 14% of people had any form of post-secondary education. So you can see that these barriers, that the people who are coming into justice system involvement really were facing, dealing with lower educational attainment, less work experience. Furthermore, we also know that when people re-enter society or are coming out of justice involvement, they face significant bias from employers when going through the hiring process. Even with the ban the box movement, it usually will still come up at some point. There's still questions about history. And in a study conducted, only 40% of employers reported being willing to consider a person with a criminal record. Not only that, once again, this is an issue that falls disproportionately on communities of color. Black applicants with criminal records have a callback rate of only 5%. So dealing with extreme bias from employers and being able to access employment. A third major barrier faced by a justice-involved population is the number of collateral consequences that impact the ability of individuals to gain employment. Specifically around services that require credentialing, it can be extremely difficult to work around those barriers. And then when looking forward from the pandemic, growth industries like healthcare have some of the highest rates of credentialing barriers and collateral consequences. These collateral consequences can both exist while someone is justice involved, but they carry well beyond justice involvement. So even after someone is no longer incarcerated or under supervision, they still may not be able to gain those credentials. In some cases, things such as fines and fees can prevent them from being able to get driver's licenses and to use that information on unemployment or to be able to get to a job, especially in rural areas. And so just a number of collateral consequences that make access to services or employment more difficult for this population. And then the last major barrier is that even when individuals who are actively justice involved are able to secure employment, conditions of community supervision can make maintaining that employment extremely difficult. So when employers are working with someone who's justice involved, they may either not know that person is justice involved or just have never worked with that in the past. And a probation officer stopping by for a check-in can lead to someone losing their job. The need to go to court can lead to someone losing employment. There are situations where a technical violation or a failure to pay restitution can result in a short 40 to 72-hour stint in a correctional facility, but that person may not be able to contact their employer, may miss a shift, lose employment. So any number of conditions of community supervision or justice involvement can make it even more difficult for these individuals to maintain their employment. However, next slide, please. We do know that when accessing high quality education, workforce development, and CTE services, it does have a real impact on outcomes. So the RAND Corporation conducted a meta-analysis, of a number of studies on the impacts of correctional education. And those who completed programming while incarcerated had their odds of recidivating reduced by 43%. For those who don't know, recidivism is the rate at which an individual comes back into contact with the justice system. It's a little fuzzy, it gets defined differently by different groups. Sometimes it's reconviction, sometimes it's rearrest. The period of time differs, so it's a fuzzy stat, but the idea is here that whatever measure was being utilized, it greatly reduced the chances of recidivating. And those individuals who are able to go through educational services had a 13% more likely opportunity to find employment. We just see anecdotally from all of our work, especially for a young adult population that's usually transitioning between systems, trying to move to self-sustaining, getting a job for the first time, living alone for the first time. For those individuals who are justice involved, access to a job is a really critical component to maintaining themselves in the community in a supportive way and in a way that allows them to build their lives moving forward, coming off that justice system involvement. Next slide. Unfortunately, through two 50-state surveys looking at what sort of educational and career and technical education and workforce development services were available to people who were justice involved, we found that the services were not really meeting the needs of this population. So you can see that this slide, which is looking at the criminal justice throughout adults and some of the key building blocks of education, educational services around and what was provided in different states. So you can see the four building blocks were funding, what sort of course offerings were available, sorry, it's a little small on my screen, lack of sorry about that, 1 second. Lack of restrictions, so talking about collateral consequences, but also the ability of individuals to gain access to services. So some services may have restrictions around what sort of crimes a person has committed, And so looking at those restrictions, and then what sort of incentives and supports existed around providing support to this population as they moved into educational services. And what we found was that 0 states had all 4 building blocks. So when you think about providing, for a justice-involved population, one of the real keys is providing the services that meet the full continuum of needs. So you can't just provide workforce services, you can't just provide CBT, you can't just provide education, but really need to meet all of the needs of this population in order to improve access. And what we saw was 0 states had all 4, 0 states had all 4 building blocks. We also saw that 10 states had none of these building blocks, so weren't providing any of the key core components. So really struggling to meet the needs of the educational needs of an adult population. I just saw that question pop up. The building blocks data was collected this past year. The survey was conducted in 2019. So really recent data. This was reported directly from the states themselves. We put out the report. We then fact checked with the states. We had some states write in and say this is incorrect. And so this is fact checked directly back from the states themselves. In the report, which I can have Brianna send out or link to, it goes through what goes into those different building blocks, the incentives of support, lack of restrictions, but don't think we have quite enough time today to go through that. The next slide, please. In addition, we also conducted a 50-state survey of juvenile justice systems and what they were providing. And what we found was similar findings of states, and this is also, this survey was conducted in 2018, but we identified 4 sort of core components of strong career and technical education and workforce development services. And that was employability, skills training, on-site and online CTE programs, work-based hands-on learnings, and industry-recognized credentials. And similar, what we found was very few states were offering the entire suite of services. Only 8 states were offering all 4 of 4 services, and 21 offering 3 of 4 services. And so what we really found was that while youth and juvenile justice systems may have had access to, one thing, they may have been able to gain access to industry recognized credentials, they weren't having their soft skill development trained. If they were able to engage in soft skill development, they weren't then able to access industry recognized credentials. So really limiting in terms of the ability of building the full suite of services necessary to gain and maintain employment. And we also found that when looking at partnerships, was that resources that were available to provide access to these services weren't being properly utilized. So even though WIOA Title I, II, and IV funds can all be utilized to support services for this population, we found that only 11 states were utilizing WIOA funds in order to support services. Perkins, additionally, we know Perkins 5 plans just went through or are going through the process right now of being finalized. It has up to a 2% set aside for working with a justice-involved population, and only just over half of states were utilizing these resources to provide services. So this gap of services that existed wasn't solely driven, by the lack of resources. It's that there weren't the partnerships necessary to drive the resources being utilized appropriately to provide those services. So the next slide. So then thinking through what can state leaders do to support access to this population. Just some of the key things that we talked about is systems collaboration. So when working in your state, make sure that you are formally engaging with your justice system leaders, both criminal and juvenile justice. Maybe that's serving within facilities, maybe it's for, setting up to provide for ward handoffs, where the access to the services that are in the community are provided to individuals in the facility before they leave and are working with reentry partners. Engage in collaborative case planning. So if you have a youth or a young adult that's in your services that is justice involved, are you meeting with their probation, with their probation case manager to talk about how schedules are being managed, how to make sure they're being supported, that there aren't duplicative efforts, really having formal agreements, MOUs in place around what those sort of partnerships and transfers look like. And that also allows you to then actively recruit from this population. Also make sure that the services that are available through these partnerships are up to statewide CTE standards. A lot of CTE services that are available within facilities or through justice systems are just created because a certain employee was interested in it. They're not matched to industry recognized credentials. They're not matched to statewide CTE services. So really make sure that you all are providing the support necessary to help these justice systems make sure the services they're providing are high quality. Additionally, on service delivery, one of the key things to recognize is that a justice-involved population has really distinct needs. Young adult population has developmentally distinct needs that needs to be met, but when working with a justice-involved population, it's really key to meet the needs of them in a distinct way, to have a program that's designed to meet that population. So whether that's thinking through the collateral consequences when thinking through placement and service supervision, whether it's engaging with probation and understanding the fines and fees and restitution needs of the individual if they have to make sure that they're bringing in some level of income, whether that is working with employers and understanding what it means to work with a justice-involved population, but really make sure it's critical. And then speaking of just right now during the pandemic, how can individuals be linked with distance-based learning tools? So asking, do you have access to a tablet? Do you have access to the internet? How can we make sure that we're providing you with these resources to allow you to access these high quality services? The next part is restrictions. Many services will restrict individuals' participation based off a criminal history. So try to work with service providers to ensure that justice system involvement is not a barrier to access. That is something that people can work through, that it's not an automatic no. Recognizing that if you're working with kids, there has to be some level, especially around sex-based offenses, where there might be some restrictions. But in general, that service providers are not making restrictions that rule out just based on justice system needs. And then additionally, thinking through collateral consequences. So making sure that you're not placing an individual who cannot work in the healthcare field into a healthcare planning program. And really thinking through those decisions when you're engaging with this population. And then the last is funding. There are resources available. One of the things, we had meetings with Department of Labor earlier this week, and they mentioned that WIOA normally has a place-based restriction for distance-based learning services, where in order for the state to pay, they had to have a physical presence in the state. Those are likely to be relaxed. I don't know if that's official yet, or if that's just still coming through. But that means that WIOA resources will be able to go to fund any distance-based CTE services. So utilizing the resources as necessary to link to the high quality, high industry recognized credentials, services, and making sure that that's getting into the hands of this community. And specifically also just talking through those connections with justice system partners about what services do exist and about what resources do exist, because it's possible that those services are already available and that justice systems just aren't aware that they are there. And so they're funneling and making referrals to other system services. So really having conversations, even now during COVID, we know a lot of, all of the case planning is happening distance-based. Still reach out to those justice systems. You can still talk to probation officers and build those referral pipes into this population. So I know that was a very quick overview, and that's my last slide, but hopefully I'll be able to ask any questions either now or after the next presentation.
Great, thank you, Jacob. I think you brought up a really good point about leveraging the flexibility that exists right now to actually improve the quality of programs that historically marginalized populations have access to. So I'm going to turn it over to Carrie, who's going to talk specifically about how state leaders can leverage this time to support Native and tribal populations.
Thank you. Yate Belladonna Nishni Totsoni Bashishin Daba Dashishe Kiani Dashanali Namishin Carrie Billy. As President and CEO of the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, or AIHEC, I am thrilled to be here on behalf of the nation's tribal colleges and universities. And I know that a lot of you might not know very much about tribal colleges, so I wanted to start by sharing briefly a little bit about the tribal college movement. And then I'll give you some specific examples of TCU responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, how they're delivering classes, particularly CTE, and addressing the academic, physical, mental, and behavioral health needs of our students and communities. Next. The first tribal college was established a little more than 50 years ago for two reasons: the near complete failure of the US higher education system to address the needs of or even include American Indians, and two, the need to preserve our culture, our language, our lands, our sovereignty, our past and our future. Next, the goal was to build our own education systems founded on our ways of knowing, traditional knowledge, and spirituality. Next, we've grown from one tribal college to 37 institutions operating more than 75 sites in 16 states. TCUs, or tribal colleges, serve about 160,000 American Indians, Alaska Native, and other rural community residents every year in academic, CTE, and community-based education programs every year. Next, and our collective vision that we all work on together is strong sovereign nations through excellence in tribal higher education. Next. To achieve this vision, tribal colleges focus on opportunity for a healthier life, a more stable and prosperous community, a revitalized language and culture, an engaged citizenry, and a safer and more secure environment. Career and technical programs have always been a key part of that work, from training teachers and nurses, which is a little bit messed up there in the view, but to growing an IT workforce, carpenters, electricians, water quality technicians, environmental managers, anything that it takes to rebuild their nations. Next, tribal colleges are building their nations one student at a time. All TCUs offer certificate and associate degree programs. 16 have bachelor's degree programs, primarily in career and technical fields such as engineering, nursing, environmental science, and teaching. The average age of our students is 16 to 24, and most live in poverty in some of the most rural and remote regions of this country. 78% of our students receive maximum Pell benefits, and most live at homes with extended families. Next, even in normal times, tribal colleges do their work in very challenging circumstances. Add a pandemic to that, and at times the mountain to the other side seems nearly, but not completely, unattainable. Next, even before the pandemic, tribal colleges, on average, had the worst internet access at the highest cost of any institutions of higher education in the country. Our internet operates at our slowest speeds. Our communities have the least access. Many tribal communities have no internet access. And our equipment is older, and there's less of that available compared to other institutions of higher education. Next. Except for one or two TCUs, our colleges are not part of the state or regional higher education networks. I always say if you look at maps like this, you can see where Indian country is or what's left of Indian country. That's the big gaps there. That's Indian country. That's where our tribal colleges are. Today, some of our tribal communities are being hit even harder. Next. In addition to internet access, the health status, physically and mentally, of our students and communities lags behind the rest of the nation. Today, as I said, some of our tribal communities are being hit harder by the COVID-19 pandemic than any other communities in the country. Next, but we believe that we are resilient people, and the resiliency of our ancestors, through that, we are finding the strength to innovate, adapt, and fulfill our mission. Next, I think Dr. Charles Russell, the president of Diné College, perhaps said it best. He said, "We are serving a nation that has been knocked down, but we are not victims. We are serving our students, and our students are committed to learning, even if that means learning from a hospital bed." One of the most important things TCUs are doing right now is helping to take care of the physical needs of our students so they can continue to learn. They're providing emergency checks, emergency aid checks. They're serving meals in safe, physically distant environments, and they're keeping their dorms open and clean so students who have no safe place to go can stay on campus and continue their programs, even if that means virtually. Next, Diné College and Navajo Technical University, which with Diné College serves the Navajo Nation, which is a vast land about the size of the state of Connecticut, but without the infrastructure. Navajo Tech, Diné College, all of our tribal colleges have moved to virtual online classes, but continuing to try to adapt and serve their students even better. They've moved to online classes in all respects, except for a few CTE courses, and they all, like most institutions, had to do that in a 2-week time frame. First, at Navajo Tech, they made sure that students could access the college's wireless internet access from their wireless internet from the cars and trucks in as many campus parking lots as possible. They developed a strategy to communicate daily, multiple times with students through Facebook. Facebook's still really popular among us Native people of all ages. So through Facebook's, text, and phone calls. They developed infographics for teaching students and faculty about the new environment that they're learning in. And they converted at Navajo Tech college vans into the NTU Homework Express to deliver and pick up student homework assignments across the reservation. And this included equipment and materials for CTE classes. Next, NTU, like other TCUs, work with partners to ensure that internet hotspots were located around the reservation closer to students' homes, because after all, only so many students can physically distance in a college campus parking lot. So they wanted them to be closer to home, not necessarily have internet access at home, because that's impossible if you don't have the towers there in the first place, but creating these community hotspots. Next, NTU went beyond using online instruction for academic and CTE courses. They are adapting all their summer programs, even robotics and an advanced manufacturing skill building institutes, to online programming. For the Advanced Manufacturing Institute, which involves tribal college students from around the whole consortium of colleges, special high-powered and application-loaded laptops are being provided to the students. They're really working to build the opportunity to explore and to elevate and experience identity, as Michaela was saying earlier, so really appreciated that. Next, like all TCUs, Navajo Tech knows that serving students means for us sustaining the community. The college has become a COVID-19 testing site. Its cafeteria has stayed open to provide meals to students and others who are using the parking lot for internet access. Next. And not satisfied simply with holding a virtual commencement, which I think a lot of institutions are doing, NTU took the extra step of honoring graduate students each day with special messages and photos posted on Facebook and other social media, so each student had their own time for their family and community to celebrate them. Again, looking at the importance of identity and that asset building that Michaela mentioned. Next. Bay Mills Community College, which is located in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, also moved most of its CTE courses, including advanced manufacturing, online. And it was one of the first colleges in the nation to use its 3D printers to make face shields and other devices for first responders and hospitals. Now, as local businesses are opening up, Bay Mills is making these face masks, face shields available to all businesses in the region to help them. The college is partnering with local mental health providers and the tribe to address students' mental health needs and providing online opportunities to connect and share. And we're finding that our students really are building this community in an online way with each other, which is really great. Next. At Chandeska-Chicana Community College, faculty are meeting students anywhere they can to provide homework, and access to the internet, laptops, whatever they can, including track phones, which the students are using because most of them didn't have internet access at home. So they're giving them track phones to access their courses, and even providing wireless access gift cards to keep those track phones and devices working and running. Next. Some tribal colleges are extending the academic semester to allow students to complete CTE courses. Others are opening earlier in the fall. And most of our institutions, at least right now, are looking at opening on site in some fashion, particularly for their CTE courses next fall. They are holding classes on site, as I mentioned, but with reduced faculty and student ratios, 2 to 5 students, for example, some of them 1-to-1, especially for competency demonstrations, of course, with the proper PPE and physical distancing. Next. Oh, sorry. Oglala Lakota College on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. So I don't know if you can go back, but if you could, that would be great. Is using Zoom classes. Everybody's using Zoom. They're making it as easy as possible. Again, trying to focus on positive aspects of students, not get them down. So they're allowing their testing to be open books. They're using a lot of websites, industry created websites and virtual labs that industries have created to provide instruction for their classes and to help students. They're distributing actual construction material, IT material, so students can assemble projects at home using video monitors which their professors connect to so they can watch them do this kind of work. And they're giving a lot of hands-on support through constant surveys, technology, calls, multiple touches, online training opportunities, and everything they can to kind of rebuild confidence and let students know that they can complete their courses and use this disruption to innovate and discover more of who they are as a Native person. Next. One of the things that sets tribal colleges apart from other institutions is the importance of culture, identity, and spirituality. That's the core of tribal colleges. Our courses, we don't just interject or add culture and identity to them. It comes from that cultural core, and then we design the courses around that. So we're using this time to look at ways that students can reflect on the importance of culture, identity. Next, spirituality and community, to look at those and see what that means to their community, to themselves as a Native person in this time of disruptive, transformative change. We were really worried about this aspect of tribal colleges because something one student said to me a couple of years ago, we start every week with a pipe and end every week with a drum. And so we were thinking, how can we do this online? So we've come up with this idea of maybe doing the student reflective opportunity, and we're hoping to do it tribal college-wide. Next. So all tribal colleges can look at what identity, community, land, and place, sovereignty, and spirituality mean to them, to their community in this time, as I said, of disruptive change, how we can turn this into an opportunity to explore who we are as people and as a community. So all with the goal, as I said earlier, next, to work toward achieving that mission of strong sovereign tribal nations through excellence in tribal higher education. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Carrie, particularly for bringing that post-secondary perspective. I really liked your point about how this challenge that a lot of states are facing can also be an opportunity for innovation, particularly when it comes to supporting historically marginalized population. So thank you all for presenting today. So what you've heard today is 3 different perspectives on how coronavirus has impacted CTE learners and potential considerations and strategies that can be used to address those challenges. However, we recognize that coronavirus has impacted numerous populations and presented a variety of different challenges for state CTE leaders. To support states during this time, Advance CTE has created a COVID-19 page that has resources to help states navigate through some of the challenges presented by coronavirus. Additionally, we have also created a blog series called Navigating CTE During COVID-19 that outlines considerations and practices that states can leverage to address concerns they have around distance learning, work-based learning, industry-recognized credentials, and equity. And you can access this by going to our blog and selecting the COVID-19 and CTE series. So unfortunately, we do not have time for a Q&A, but I encourage you to reach out to the speakers with any questions that you have. Thank you so much for joining today's Summer Learning Series webinar. Before leaving this meeting, please complete this quick evaluation that will pop up on your screen. We want to make sure that this series is meeting your needs. If you have any questions or other thoughts, we welcome your messages in the chat box, and we will follow up after this session. A recording of this call will be posted to our website, and registration is open for our next Summer Learning Series webinar called Career Technical Education and Talent Pipeline Management, Strategies for Connecting Classrooms to Careers. And we hope that you will join us on June 18th for that webinar. A link to the registration for that event is going to be posted to the chat box right now. Thank you so much to our speakers. This was really great information and gives our members a lot to think on. So thank you.
Thank you.